Film criticism in general, and welcome you to the final lecture that Elvis is giving us tonight or this afternoon. I will also say that one of the pleasures of having Elvis here is to pick up the Friday New York Times, which is always rich with film criticism and individual reviews, and to notice that Elvis wasn't in the pages of the Times today. And I think we here at Harvard know why. It's because he's spent his time doing these extraordinary lectures that we are the much smaller audience, but much more the great beneficiary of. I think there's a tendency to look at film, particularly in the context of a place like Harvard, as a fairly modest form, as a kind of newcomer, particularly in an arena where the text is king. The moving image seems spectral and maybe a bit subjective and maybe a bit suspect. So writing about cinema does not seem to be of great importance within the larger issues of the day. And clearly, writing about cinema in general looks like a peripheral activity, as if it's kind of part of the entertainment industry, part of leisure time activity, rather than part of the lives that we live. I would argue a slightly different position. The cinema for us is a text, and for me it's a very primary text. The culture that we live in is increasingly a moving image-based culture. To make sense of the things that we see on our laptop screen, on our television sets, on all forms of information that assault us daily, we need to have an understanding of the logic of the moving image, the logic of sound and picture. The Rosetta Stone, the great dead language of that logic, is indeed the cinema. And one of the great writers about contemporary cinema is our guest today, Elvis Mitchell. Now, I want to also just say briefly that I believe film criticism in this country does matter. And I have a rather moving letter that attests to the importance of the writing that Elvis and his colleagues have done. In this very room last Sunday, we were to have had the Iranian director Elvis Kiarostami. Kiarostami was to have come to the New York Film Festival to introduce his new film 10, to a museum in Columbus, Ohio, and the third stop, the final stop, was here in this room to introduce a screening of that same film 10. Kiarostami never made it to the US. He never made it to New York. When he went to the American Embassy in Paris, he was told that he needed to come 8 weeks earlier. Why? Well, they needed to do a background check. The very same embassy that had virtually every time he'd ever traveled to the States given him his visa, now told him that he was a stranger and he was unwelcomed. That offended many people, and in the French media, it became front page news in Le Monde. It also offended many people in this country, and in the American film press, it became front page news. Now, Kiarostami was very aware of this situation, and this is a letter that he sent by fax. And I can say I've been working on and off with Kiarostami on a number of projects, probably for about 6 or 7 years. It's maybe only the second or third letter I've ever received from him, so it was something that he thought was important enough to write. And I'll just read this very briefly because I think it speaks volumes about the nature of contemporary culture and about the importance of something that may seem as modest and marginal as film criticism. This is Kiarostami's letter. I should have been there with you attending the Harvard Film Archive screening. Nevertheless, we all know that the world is going through a very difficult time. We sometimes need these kinds of reactions just to open our eyes and to see what is really happening around us. I always heard about the ivory tower of intellectual people. Now I know for a fact that along with other colleagues, we have been living there with our privileges and not assuming our responsibilities the way we should. I'm very impressed by the reaction of the American press, filmmakers, and other cultural persons, not because they are defending one person's right, but because they are pointing out the Achilles heel of a system. I am grateful to them because they give me enough reason to believe in the future of humanity, in spite of all the facts, and to keep the luxury of remaining the incorrigible optimist I have always been. All the best, Elvis Kiarostami. So what does this have to do with Elvis Mitchell? Well, Elvis Mitchell was very much part of that media reaction. But let me say very briefly a little bit about why I think Elvis is, even within that world of New York film criticism, a unique individual. Many people come to writing about criticism with an attitude that they're going to write a kind of canonical interpretation, a canonical gloss on what a film means. Elvis is fully capable of saying in depth what a film means, but he's also very much aware of the context in which a film is made and the context in which it's received. When I read Elvis Mitchell, I feel that he is pulling me by the lapels and saying to me, look at this, attend to this. He's really, in some ways, the best of all writers because he's a writer with something to say. He has a remarkable sense of the art of film and encyclopedic knowledge of cinema history, but he's also very much focused on where this work exists within the here and now. And he's one of the few writers that I know that can both say something about cinema that has a kind of lasting impact. I clip his reviews. They really do have a lasting impact, but who can also speak to the moment, why this is important now. To me, Elvis adds to our understanding of the visual culture around us, and he does really, in what Kiarostami says, he gives us that luxury to remain an optimist about the future of the culture, be it the moving image culture or the larger culture. And I have to say, I'm enormously pleased that he's given up these days of writing his daily reviews for the New York Times to come here to Harvard to lecture and to be with us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Elvis Mitchell.
Wow. Yeah, we should pass the plate around or something for the Sunday church social. Actually this week I have been writing. I guess one of my pieces didn't run today, but I've been writing New York Film Festival stuff, and it's a very hard time to be away. It's a very exciting time, and actually a very hopeful time for the movies during the New York Film Festival, and it's the only thing that could get me away would be to come to something like this, because I've had to give this a great deal of thought. When I met Skip last summer in London, and he asked me if I thought I might want to do something like this, and I said, okay, thinking, thank God he will never ask me. And by the time I got back to New York, there was a letter waiting for me outlining dates. So I couldn't think, well, no, I'll be washing my hair this week, because that actually takes a long time for me to do, as you can tell. But I had to start thinking about what I wanted to say, because I feel it's a slippery slope to talk about African Americans in cinema, because there is an attempt to sort of, I think, bring too much importance to bear on some aspects of the cinema that wouldn't withstand that kind of pressure. On the other hand, it's important not to be dismissive of it. And the topic for this last conversation, this last monologue, monotone, as you may understand it to be in a few minutes, is what's next. And you know, that's an interesting question to ask about the movies, what's next, because I feel like I'm often, I don't know, maybe disappointed by the movies, because I have so much hope. I have so much faith that they will be better, that they will be different somehow. And obviously, certainly, what black filmmakers have to say, what black film artists have to say means a lot more to me. What next is a question I ask myself all the time, because, you know, there'll come a point where I'll see something like Booty Call and I'll feel like giving up. And the next thing I know, it's 5 years later, and Bernie Mac has done the original Kings of Comedy, and brought that holy roller's ferocity of his, and an actor's commitment, an actor's concentration to the material. And I think, okay, I shouldn't have given up 5 years ago. And I'll see him in Ocean's 11, and I'll think, he's just not pretending to be an actor. This isn't a burlesque. This is a real performance. This is an understanding, an intuitive understanding of what an actor does. And I'll think back when I saw Booty Call, and I'll think, gee, okay, maybe Jamie Foxx wasn't bad in it, but it's still Booty Call. and I'll see Jamie Foxx in Ali. And even though Booty Call for critics felt like the end of the world as we know it, when you see Ali and you see Jamie Foxx giving the best possible performance you can imagine, and more importantly, a performance that you couldn't imagine, because there's a kind of a dynamism that he's worked out that you see Will Smith responding to. You see him directing it, and you see what goes on in that scene is something that has been, since the beginning of time for black actors in cinema, something that they have done, which is to say they've taken the scene away from what's on the page, which is always at best a two-dimensional understanding of it. And for Michael Mann, he basically tends to work things out in almost narcissistic terms. I mean, he turns Muhammad Ali into Michael Mann, an ascetic who wears black suits and is incapable of pleasure. But what Drew Bundini Brown, as personified by Jamie Foxx, did is bring it away from that. He engages Will Smith in a way that the material never does. And I think, okay, I shouldn't give up hope. But we get back to a question, don't we? What's next? It's the unasked question at the end of almost every movie. That is, if the movie feels incomplete to us, we say, well, what happens to this couple in the movie now? Will they remain in love? Will they work it out? Do the actors even get along on screen? What happens now that the heroes cut the red wire instead of the yellow wire? Can he go back to the station house and be treated well because of it? But if a movie isn't properly shaped, it's the first thing that comes to mind as we stumble out over the mountain of popcorn and the licorice rinds and try not to step in the gum as we leave the theater. What next is a question we all ask as we remember to be kind and rewind. What next? It's the question that sends us scurrying to the extra supplemental material on the DVD, hoping that somewhere in an interview there's an answer that will make this movie make some kind of sense to us. That somewhere in those 3 or 4 deleted scenes you'll see, oh, that's what this movie was supposed to be, instead of thinking, well, the studio's right to cut that garbage out. What next? It's what we want to know. I mean, maybe the director will spell out what his intentions were supposed to be and how the movie was derailed. But you know, they always end up saying it was like a family, and we all loved working together so very much because they don't want to alienate anybody. I guess when you ask what's next, that feels like the movie's fundamentally failed us in some ways. And that can be especially painful when it's a movie about an African-American subject or a movie from an African-American director. I think it doesn't matter because there are still so few that every time the lights go down or we hit play on the machine, our expectations are raised and we want to feel that in some way we see ourselves on the screen or see a part of ourselves that we want to see on the screen. And that's a dangerous slope too, because it's an awful position to put someone who aspires to be an artist in, to make him responsible for our feelings about ourselves. And it's a double standard that unfortunately many African-American filmmakers and actors and actresses have to bear up under. But on the other hand, what's next can also be a great question, because often a story can be so pat in a schematic kind of way that it's worked out the plot so deftly there's nothing left for us to do. And if we don't ask what's next, then it means we were never involved in the picture in the first place. The movie just drips out of your head so profoundly that when you see a commercial for the picture, again, you go, I gotta see that. Not realizing that you've seen it already and it's already been washed away from the beaches of your mind. What's next can even be a necessary question, because we become so involved with those people and the lives they're leading on screen and the situations that we're seeing depicted that we have to know more. The movies, if we're lucky, plug into our heads and into our hearts and into our, well, I guess what Balzac called our sympathetic imagination. And for African Americans, in the movies, what is simultaneously, I think, an inspired and a depressing question: what's next? If we're lucky, we need to know more about these people. We're so gripped by the story that somehow the narrative to us will seem maddeningly incomplete. In the past couple of days, I've talked about pride and anger as motivating forces in the African American cinema. And there is one more connective element in that sort of periodical table between those forces in this context. It's a thing that brings them both together you can find in both cases, and that's ambition. It's the knot that ties pride and anger together for African Americans in the movies. It's the single ingredient that unites Sammy Davis Jr. and Dorothy Dandridge and Bill Bojangles Robinson and Sidney Poitier and Denzel Washington and Halle Berry. It's what they all share. It's part of that DNA that's brought them to where they are. It's what has kept our people going strong and going and wanting to work out the chilling circumstances that have kept us functioning while being demeaned and disavowed. Let me read to you a list of movies. Black Caesar, Black Shampoo, Black Gestapo, Black Fist, Black Eye, The Black Six, Blackenstein, Blackula, Black Gun, Black Jack, Black Fox, 5 on the Black Hand side, Black Godfather, Black Samson, Black Jesus, Black Eliminator, Black Godfather, Black Lolita, Black Heat, and Black Belt Jones. This black list eventually led to a blackout. It was the same movie over and over and over again. And how much pride could you have as being cast as the star of Black Gestapo, really? What do you say to your mother? Let me read you another list. Black Sunday, Black Windmill, Black Bart, The Black Bird, The Black Cauldron, Black Gold, Another Black Fox, Black Christmas. There's a point to this list too, and that is, intriguingly, that there are far more movies with black in the title that have nothing to do with black people than the reverse. And there have been movies with black in the title and have black people in them that are far more damaging than any litany of blaxploitation pictures I can mention, far more damaging than any Black Caesar or Blackenstein or any of those other things. And the movie I'm thinking about are movies like Black Hawk Down, a two-fisted tribute to America that ends up becoming racist by giving short shrift to the Africans it's supposed to be about. And it's a movie that's celebrated because of its callous jingoism. This can't even be blamed on the source material because the book upon which Black Hawk Down is based may have been jingoistic, but it was clearly not racist. The book details the casual indifference of the Americans and points out the assiduous, unintentional insults that were responsible for the widespread animosity and the eventual violence against them. Insults which ended up triggering a cascade of murderous retaliation. The movie Black Hawk Down ignores this crucial background information and turns the Africans into merciless, ungrateful savages. And in a final atrocity, underplays a number of African fatalities that came as a result of that skirmish. And black actors are employed in this picture, both Africans and African Americans. If getting the lead in Black Gestapo was horrifying to an actor of color, how does one maintain any self-respect after being hired to star in a movie that treats blacks like the Gestapo? Certainly, the implication is that the current state of affairs is worse than ever. How can you hold your head up having been cast in Black Hawk Down? I understand. Actors need to work. Families have to be cared for. Bills have to be paid. But in the end, shame gets fed too. And when Black Hawk Down is treated like a remarkable cinematic achievement and nominated for several Oscars, including Best Picture, then it's easy to understand the component that I've alluded to when talking about pride and anger and even ambition. And that component is pain. I mean, for me, it was tough to pick up the papers and read the kind of encomia lavished on Black Hawk Down. Maybe 30, 35 years ago, when audiences and critics were presumably less sensitive to what is called the third world, when apartheid's heart was still beating, and an embrace of such a movie might have made sense. Well, actually, it wouldn't have made any sense then either, but at least would have been understandable. But the response in those less enlightened days, again, would have been part of the context of the era. But for all the controversy over Halle Berry and Monsters Ball, for all the attacks over Training Day, for all the tumult over Ali, which I helped to stir up, and its inaccuracies and failings, for all the unnecessary furor about Barbershop, for that matter, that Black Hawk Down was lionized as an effective, serious, and thoughtful action picture that raised issues, and not be looked upon as a racist video game that it was, is nothing short of infuriating. If anything, Black Hawk Down shows how much further we as a people have to go in the Cinematheque. Miles to go before we get deep. And that brings us back to the question, what next? If you're a creative person of color and you prize your integrity, how do you walk into a studio and have any faith that your ideas about any movie that isn't a sweetly superficial trifle like a romantic comedy will be taken seriously? It's the kind of atmosphere that makes me trepidatious, so I can only imagine when a director is going out trying to raise money for his or her next project and is armed with the information like the box office grosses and the critical acclaim that Black Hawk Down receives. Where do you find hope? How do you handle that? This rush of pride, anger, ambition, and pain must be channeled. It must be reckoned with, because that ambition, that need to make a movie that everyone tells you there's no audience for, and that tough-mindedness to keep going and keep searching for money and keep digging for actors and looking for sets and finding the sort of compromises and sort of trades to get a picture made, that's all you have to keep you going. Sometimes pain is as good as money. I've been asked the question any number of times about the most woefully underrepresented part of this equation, and that's women, actresses, writers, and directors of color. And how do they deal with this? And it's by using that hard-headedness, that unyielding knowledge that your picture deserves to be made and deserves to be seen, despite how many times you're told no. And that will have to do the trick, because it will be, in a number of cases, all you have. Casey Lemons, the writer-director of Eve's Bayou and the director of Caveman's Valentine, decided that she had to abandon her acting career because she only had so many years left. And after you get past 26, if you're not a movie star, you don't exist anymore. And there are fewer and fewer places, now that the WB and UPN have given up on black people, as we know them, for a black woman to get work. She decided that she had to focus on being behind the camera to succeed. She's an able and talented actress, capable of projecting intelligence on screen, which is a rare quality, because how often have you seen anybody in the movies and thought they were capable of independent thought? Not a whole lot. But she decided that it was time for her to make the next move. You may remember her, most notably, she was Jodie Foster's partner in Silence of the Lambs, but she's done other notable work as well. And she was determined to get Eve's Bayou made. When she was able to persuade Samuel L. Jackson to come aboard as co-star executive producer and use his considerable weight and heat to get the movie made, then it became an immovable force. The picture wasn't going to go away. Eve's Bayou, as a result, became one of the highest-grossing independent films of that year. Actually, one of the highest-grossing independent films ever. And usually, such a triumph basically translates into further work. But it's always tougher for African-American women. Let's examine the case of writer-director Julie Dash. Since Dash brought her heartfelt debut feature, Daughters of the Dust, to the big screen, she is yet to make another feature for theaters. It's a small, honest, and earnest picture about the lives of women in the simple gullah culture of South Carolina. And it's a movie whose influence probably was felt on Eve's Bayou. Daughters of the Dust, with its modest scale and economy of means and sharply defined melodrama, it provoked enough attention from critics and audiences to make anyone think that Dash would be welcomed back behind the screen as a creative force. That was over a decade ago, and she's been relegated to a few pieces for hire for television. Probably all the while scratching her head raw, trying to raise up enough money and pull together the resources to get a picture made. But actors feel like they only have so many movies in them, and they can only commit for so long before, again, bills have to be paid, families have to be fed. But the life to pay attention to here really is Dinah Sands, a wonderfully vital and stirring actress, probably best remembered for a role as a demanding younger sister in A Raisin in the Sun, or a part she originated on Broadway. Not content to wait for the movies to find her, she polished her skills on the legitimate stage. In the 60s, the time where blacks could still find work, when the theater was still new and exciting, where the Negro Ensemble Company would create for you. You could get in and be a part of it. Where theater was democratic, and it took only $2 to go to off-Broadway theater and $6 to see a Broadway show. You couldn't even park for that kind of money in New York these days. She used her skills to their utmost on the Broadway stage. Among other things, she originated the role of the truth-teller prostitute in The Owl and the Pussycat, a part that Barbra Streisand claimed for herself in the movie version, which is kind of like being to have, oh, I don't know, Terry Garr play Shaft, but you know, things work out the way they work out. Streisand saw the meaty potential in this stereotypical piece after Sands found the earthy honesty in the role. There was nothing remotely actressy about Dinah Sands. She had an unerring aim for deflating whatever fakeries cropped up before her, and her tongue and attitude were like a scythe, is what she was famous for. Her filmography was to have included what would have been her crowning role, probably, Claudine, a lovely and realistic, ghetto-fabulous romantic fable in which she was to have played a single working black mother struggling to raise her 6 kids and balance her romance with a working man with high hopes, a garbage man. And unlike the cat played by Sammy Davis Jr. in Ocean's 11, this garbage man was to be secure in his masculinity and eager to be a part of Claudine's complicated emotional life. He was played by James Earl Jones. Sands never got to play Claudine. But at least this time, she wasn't elbowed out of the way by Barbra Streisand. She was replaced in Claudine by Diane Carroll, who got to exploit the likable, down-and-dirty simplicity that you might have forgotten she was capable of. Sands wasn't replaced through petty squabbling or creative differences or a catty campaign by Carroll to remove Sands from the picture, and a role that was sculpted for Sands' specific skills. Dinah Sands died of cancer shortly before filming was to begin. She worked until the last. In her final film, Georgia, Georgia, in 1973, she plays an expatriate American living abroad who falls for a white GI fleeing the war. In that movie, we can almost see the magnificent light dimming in her eyes. Acting the role of an alert, emotionally abused woman who'd absented herself from the land that gave birth to her and squelched her opportunities must have been enormously delicious to her. The kind of thing that might have sounded great in fantasy, but it was a kind of surrender she couldn't make herself. She never gave up on America, even when it seemed to give up on her. And even when it tried to subject her to pressures that would eventually take her down. She was too big an actress for that, too big a talent. It was disease that finished her off. Though we wonder if the cancer that ate through her insides felt like the powers that she had to battle for her very career for, finding a way into her blood system finally to finish her off. To once more bring Ralph Ellison into this argument, what does she do to be so black and blue? In Scarwing Baldwin's The Devil Finds Work, there's no mention of Sands there. She had already passed by the time his book was published, but he must have taken note of her piercing eyes and alert posture, how she seemed to be more than a match for Sidney Poitier in Raisin in the Sun. But Baldwin's film writing was about the mixture of fascination, awe, and contempt that movies summoned up in him, and he wrote about it masterfully. And he caught Dinah Ross briefly in those crosshairs of his, more specifically, the voluptuous ruin that was Lady Sings the Blues. He was surely upset by the lack of fidelity and didn't see the similarities between Ross's portrayal and the great sacrifice. But what he didn't see was wow, I'll try and read this in English. Let's do that. What James Baldwin should have loved and didn't see in the movie were the amazing similarities between what Diana Ross did in that movie and the great sacrificial white goddesses like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, women he felt he was being a part of. He was probably able to feel deep in his bones that Dinah Ross was going to squander the future that Lady Sings the Blues would give her. He somehow knew that movie stardom was hers, if only she wanted it, but she really didn't. Perhaps he somehow had an inkling that Dinah Ross would turn down a romantic action melodrama that was to star her and Sylvester Stallone years later. And that picture would eventually see the light of day as The Bodyguard, with Whitney Houston and Kevin Costner. But the picture is so ashamed of his black and white pairing that Houston's face is hidden under Costner's white bread forearm. and the picture is soaked in a midnight blue so that no betraying flash of brown flesh could be seen. After Sidney Poitier made it safe for African-American men to venture before the camera, and Bill Cosby made it safe for a black man to carry a gun to protect himself and I Spy, and not run into a corner when a fight broke out and wait for the White Star to save him, it looked like Diana Ross was next, with her wide, dark eyes and pop urbanity. She'd be the one who would lead black women into a proud new era of film stardom. Yes, Pam Grier was there at that same time, but Pam Grier was a round-the-way girl who kicked a great big hole into the heart of the movies, single-handedly bringing the freedom of a star unashamed of her body with the no-nonsense directness of an action protagonist. Before Pam Grier, movie stars were sexless or seduced and then abandoned. She plowed through her film adventures as free as any man, and when she wanted to, she got out of the bed first and went on to take care of her own business. There would probably be no Terminator movies without Pam Grier, without her proving that an action heroine could show an emotional sensitivity without screaming and fleeing when the violence broke out. What Pam Grier did was truly groundbreaking. She represented the black woman who'd been left behind by the brothers who'd been scooped up and sent off to the Vietnam War. She was a black woman who was left behind to fend for herself, and clearly capable of much more. We'd all heard about Rosie the Riveter, the American woman who found that she could do any factory job a man could when all the boys were packed off to fight the Axis powers in World War II. But Pam Grier was different. Most of the black men were drafted into a war they didn't want to go to and didn't understand. And those brothers who slipped through the cracks may have been among the brightest, but they were not the best. Against them, Pam Grier was the first and last line of defense, and she was the best. Movies were never the same after she showed up. She seized the moment and burned her brand into the movies that would eventually end the idea of women as second-class citizens on screen. She accomplished for African-American women what Bill Cosby did in I Spy for men. By demonstrating that women could care for themselves, Pam Grier made women the sleeker sex rather than the weaker sex. Diana Ross was a different case altogether. She was the first black actress to have a major studio project built around her. It had never happened before, constructed from the ground up, contoured to fit her contours. Each scene was decorated and filled with lines and filigree compatible with her talents. And the thrills and squeals when women saw an African-American woman representing them, I've never seen anything like it before. It was like stepping into a revival meeting where God himself decided to make a guest appearance. She was a recipient of a glamour treatment that had nearly disappeared from the movie scene in the 1970s altogether. As one of the Supremes, she moved like she practiced every gesture, each bat of her eyelashes in front of the mirror. But as we all know from watching Madonna, being a singer and an actress are two entirely different things. Diana Ross delivered beautifully. The only thing that kept her from winning the Oscar was a relentless and shameless campaign by the movie's producer, Berry Gordy. He turned the tide of sympathy against her. I should say here the strategy he undertook to get her the Oscar, one that seemed overwhelming in the 1970s, would seem quaint and disarming, minimalist in fact, compared to what Miramax does today. But Diana Ross made 2 other movies after that. Perhaps there was too much anxiety for her in acting, and she preferred the comfort of rousing an audience to his feet by cooing over the opening chord bombast of I'm Coming Out. I'd rather think that after the indignity of The Wiz, in which she played Dorothy, what was supposed to be a 13-year-old girl, and her determination made the picture depressing and absurd instead of just absurd. I'd like to think that after The Wiz, she decided enough was enough. That movie killed off the black film industry for years, incidentally. I like to think that she felt she'd done enough damage for one day, like the teenager who slips the car back into the garage and doesn't tell anybody the entire right side is missing after an accident. More likely, though, she had the same fickle attention span as most pop stars. Movies bored her, and movie stardom came too easily. She thought she could go back to it whenever she wanted and decided never to go back. What does movie stardom mean for those to whom it comes too cheaply? Comedians like Chris Tucker, who now earns $20 million a picture after his 4th movie. Lauryn Hill, who shows the natural ease and deportment of someone born to film stardom. and the utter disinterest of a natural flirt who wins the camera over and loses interest as soon as it falls for her. Ice Cube at least has the work ethic of a man who wants to act, and Mos Def is one of the most intriguing new camera presences in years, as is, of all people, Sean, P. Diddy, Puff Diddy, whatever you want to call him, Combs, whom Oliver Stone had originally cast in the Jamie Foxx role in Any Given Sunday. But that's the key. What next? If you're an actor who's diligent and devoted to your craft and spent years familiarizing yourself with the concept of sense memory and learned the classics and studied Baraka's contempt for movies and made your way through it anyway, what do you do when some nobody who's got a hit on the radio is picked before you for a part? It's the age-old problem, one that made Jim Brown and Fred Williamson movie stars over Sidney Poitier's contemporaries in the 60s and 70s. Samuel L. Jackson, who has spent over 20 years in the movie business before becoming a star, drew a line in the sand recently. He simply refuses to act with rappers and would-be newcomers to the movies. But it's wrong of him, I think, because to dismiss talent would be to say to Samuel L. Jackson, who had never been in the movies before, who had only done stage work, well, why should we cast you? It would be to say to Samuel L. Jackson, who had worked only with Spike Lee and had done 5 of Spike Lee's pictures, well, you've only done those black films with that one black director. Why should we consider you for something else? I guess it's okay to decide where you want to make your stand, but to be overly defensive is what has put black movies, black actors and actresses and directors in the stunted stage that it is in now. Again, the real question is, what is next? After the African-American film industry has sort of come to a scary plateau because we're told movies directed by African-Americans with black stars will only make a certain amount of money, that Will Smith is a fluke, that Denzel Washington is a fluke, that Chris Tucker is a fluke, that Barbershop is a fluke, then what are you to do? Especially at a time when the black film industry says that there are room only for a handful of A-list talents, people who basically have to make their way into the movies by fighting their way in. Spike Lee raised his own money to make She's Gotta Have It. The Hughes brothers got their start in music video. It's essentially the equivalent of having to be a football star to become an actor. You expend so much energy and waste so much resentment that by the time you get to make movies, you forget why you were there in the first place. And the worst part about this whole thing is that we're always told there's no support for the black art film. Film executives tell me this over and over again when I praise a movie like Lumumba and tell them about the ferocity and the star power and the intensity of the picture, that it works as a piece of entertainment as well as a piece of social document. They say, well, audiences won't go because black people don't read subtitles. And I say, well, what were they doing when they saw Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon? And the response is, oh, well, that's different. There's always a difference to say why something shouldn't be made. Every case of success I've named here has been going for years after they were told there was no place for them. And that same stubbornness is the only way for us to keep hope alive. Thank you. Well, if there are any questions as to why my pieces didn't run the New York Times today, no, I'm kidding. Sir.
I say, you're next. Now, I'm going to make it very brief here. I don't want to offend these people. We got to have this chance. Here's what I think. These lectures, have been for me the greatest cinematic experience of my life, because what's happened is, through the lens of you, we're doing something that the ordinary, no brush, no camera can catch. What we can do in our minds, our imagination, as we listen to you, we're filling it in, the interstices, the Lake Coney, and all that stuff. And that's the cinema of the future, because most cinema is boring. Now, over the last, even when you gave us in these 3 lectures, films, you've caught the essence, and you've given us the essence of the film coming through you, through your sensibilities, through your kind of mind, your way of looking at things. So it's the mind, which is past, I've said this before, past color. Suddenly you are, excuse me for saying it, you're Apollo, Orpheus, and the thing is,
It's going to be Orpheus descending in a minute. I mean, come on
get
now.
a taste of it. The other is born because of you. I'm not going to go to too many more movies now. I'm going to follow. I would like.
No, no, don't stop going to the movies. We can't. No, but don't. I mean, don't. Let's not.
But I'm trying to say to you, this has been like what's the term here? In my life, a critical event. This is like opened my mind up to film, what film is, and I'm longing for a time when people like you, be very few, will come and have an evening like this in this house, and we just get a flood of movies because you're speaking to our minds, our imaginations, and I rest my case. That's the future.
Okay. Are there any questions? Hi, Audrey. Oh God, yeah. And it's weird because a lot of them come up again. It's this weird sort of system of passing through ritual humiliation. And you see them like in the periphery for years. There's an actor named Terrence Howard who I saw in this awful show Sparks about a sort of storefront black law firm, and it kind of dismissed him. Then I saw him in this movie about male prostitutes called Johns, and I thought, well, maybe he has some range. And then I saw him in The Best Man, and he steals a picture. And it's with a lot of those things I was talking about in the past couple of days, that combination of rage and ambition and fear. This sort of, I have this one last opportunity, I'm going to seize it. There's a hunger that we often see in these performers, I think is what sort of kept the black cinema as it is going. Because I've met so many of these people who told me how many times they've been turned down before. And that horrible fallow period that I talked about yesterday, basically from 1960 to 1970, where black actors could barely find work. They kept going, but in those days they were lucky. They had the cinema, they had the theater. And what may happen now, what I have a lot of hope for, is again just technology is making the form more democratic. The same cameras that George Lucas uses, the video cameras he shot the last Star Wars picture with, and didn't break despite that. Will probably cost $5,000 or $10,000 in 2 years, and that's when things should get really exciting. That's when movies will become what hip-hop was in the 70s, when you have the technology to make something and reinvent it. And if that one movie doesn't hit, 2 years later, some mainstream picture starring Julia Roberts will incorporate all that technology. It's what I'm waiting, because, like I said, we're so often told that there's a room for a black art house director, somebody who's smart enough to do what Steven Soderbergh does, which is to make a movie with a mainstream star, with mainstream stars, use Godard in telling those stories, use Tarkovsky, remake Tarkovsky with George Clooney, and then make a movie for yourself. I mean, the technology will make that a lot easier. It will have to be about basically bringing the mountain to Muhammad, because in the end, there's again a centralization of movie theaters. For a while in the 60s and and then in the 70s and 80s, movie theaters were taken away from the major studios and they were owned by independent people. So you could do something like make your movie and take it around from city to city, rent a theater, put out flyers, go to the churches, and get audiences to come out. And those days don't exist anymore now, because there are 5,000 theater chains owned by one company, and now since they're all going bankrupt, they're all being consolidated, and it makes it that much tougher. But one thing I'd say to a lot of these film festivals I go to is that there's a manager of every 17 multiplex house that has the 9th showing of Spider-Man that nobody's going to, and you can talk him into giving you the theater for one night and renting it, and they'll be happy to do it, and it's a way to get people to see your stuff. I mean, in places like Detroit, where I'm from, where there is no film festival. You think Cuba Gooding Jr. is not accepted by black people? Oh, well, but Aaron's a different guy from everybody else. But I think he mostly is. I mean, Whoopi Goldberg is I'm sorry, she asked my feelings how the Cuba Gooding Jr. and Whoopi Goldberg fit into this sort of trifecta of basically of rage, pride, and ambition. And Whoopi Goldberg is all of those things. And she certainly has recreated herself. I mean, she literally made herself into something that had not been seen for years. She was a black performance artist, really, initially. I don't think she's really ever committed herself to acting now. I mean, she would rather be a star than an actor, and I think therein lies the problem, because she certainly has the chops to act if she wanted to. I mean, whatever you say about that weird The Color Purple, which is like some sort of like Amos and Andy movie directed by Bertolucci, she's not bad in it. And Cuba Gooding Jr. is a very talented actor too, but and I like the Boondocks, but you know, I understand that actors want to work, and Cuba Gooding Jr. wanted to star in this film version of a comic book called Daredevil, and he was told that a black man couldn't play the hero. But the villain in the comics, who was white, is being played by a black man, Michael Clark Duncan. So that was okay. So, you know, I mean, when the system creates contradictions, you got to keep working. And I have an enormous amount of respect for him. I think he's a very talented actor. What did you see? Yeah, I think you should. No, I think we have to. A movie like the Halle Jarima's Adwa, we have to see these movies, because the new Halle Jarima movie, because each time a movie like this is made, we have to show some support, you know? I mean, it gets back to the grassroots stuff, that thing I was talking about directors pulling all the resources they can together to get a picture made. Halle Jarima doesn't go to studios. He finds money any way he can to get a movie made. And I will say this again, I guarantee you if the right person or the wrong person sees it, some part of it will be stolen. It'll be in a movie next year with Bruce Willis and Julia Roberts. I'm not kidding you. You don't know until you see as many movies as I see how eager they are to peel from something that works. And they may not buy it from him, but they'll certainly take it from him. And the more of us that see it and get the word out that it comes from someplace else, the more important that becomes to his career in terms of finding purchase in the art house world, which he does not yet have. And once he gets that, once we get a couple of filmmakers like Jarima who make movies because they want us to get them seen, because he is determined to get these movies made, because everybody, every day somebody says to him no. Imagine that, getting up in the morning knowing that somebody's going to take something that you love and tell you it's a really ugly child who stinks and you should put it in the furnace. I mean, every day he hears that, and he goes out and finds a way to get the pictures made anyway. I feel like, and also, in addition to that, he's talented. Now, if these were bad movies, I'd be warning you off of them, but they deserve to be seen because he's a remarkable and extraordinary filmmaker with, I think, a unique sensibility. Way in the back. Stand up. Well, I guess like most African Americans, I think I have a couple of roles. I have to be true to what I think the art form is. When somebody's doing it well, I have to speak to that. But on the other hand, there are things I think I can point out. And I think about this when I remember, and I've talked about this with a bunch of actors and performers, that the mainstream critics can somehow get really incensed about movies that have a big black cast. I remember when the Boomerang was reviewed, and I'm not going to mention the critic's name, but he writes for the LA Times, and he said that this movie didn't make any sense to him because the movie with these black people never intersected with white people. Now, that same summer, Batman Returns came out, a movie in which there's not a single black person, and incidentally, Gotham City is New York City. And one character who was black in the first movie was white in the second movie, and it never occurred to him to say anything about that. So given that there's a double standard everywhere, I feel like it's somehow my position to address this, and I always have, even before I got the job at the Times, because I think a lot of film critics think that they're above race, and this country has demonstrated that it is not. And every time I step outside the New York Times building and 4 cabs go past me, I can have this sort of abstraction where I think I'm better than being black. That goes away really, really fast. Did that answer your question? I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. No, because when I don't like their movies, I have to be honest. You know, this job is meaningless if I'm not honest. First of all, I'm not being true to myself. For the most part, I've kind of always felt that the workplace is not where you go to meet friends. You have friends outside of what you do, if you're lucky. You have friends that do what you do, but I'm not an actor, and it would be dishonest for me to say that something is good when it's not good, especially in the New York Times, where you get a letter every single day about something that you write. And I have to be able to defend what I say and what I think. It's very important to me to be as truthful as I possibly can, because this means something to me. It took me a long time to get to this job. I don't like to think so, but there's a lot riding on it, because there were certainly accusations of affirmative action from people who weren't grown up to say it to my face, but word got back to me. So I have something to prove, and I've got to prove that I am good at my job and that I take my job seriously. And sort of to do any kind of special pleading would sort of contradict what I'm supposed to do in this job. Sure.
Cater to the kind of issues that we would like to come out, like acting. So, do you know anything about the writing of film script? Black people make a contribution to.
Well, there are writers there are writers who have. You have to look at it this way: for every movie script, for every picture that gets made for our studio, there are 20 scripts that they didn't shoot. That's kind of the ratio. They develop that many scripts for every picture they make. What they want to do when a studio makes a movie is come up with an equation that relieves you of making a decision in as many ways as possible. In other words, if it's a sequel or something with movie stars you know, then they figure you feel like you have to go see it because there's nothing at risk. Now, the kind of movies you're talking about have an enormous amount at risk, and these pictures have to be made generally going around to small companies, basically going around raising the money and making the picture, and then bringing it to a film festival, and hopefully somebody will say, well, I'll buy that. Or making it and then getting an agent and having it sent around so the studios will see it. Half the time, 90% of the time, these pictures will get made, and a lot of them are pretty good that play film festivals will never be seen again. Or they'll go to the Sundance Channel or the Independent Film Channel, and the filmmaker who maybe raised $1 million will get $10,000 around the picture 4 or 5 times. But you got to think about that as being basically a calling card for your next film. At a certain point, you're just trying to get your next picture made, and getting this picture made will be, entree to the next picture. These scripts are always being written. I'm always seeing them, always hearing about them, in fact. I sort of don't read them because I don't know how to read a film script. I wouldn't know what I was looking at. And I think it's unfair because somebody sends me a film script. Just because I say I like it doesn't mean somebody's going to make it. Well, the New York Times guy liked it. Why won't you make it? Shut up. We don't like him. I think it's kind of unfair for me to get involved in that part of the conversation. But I know that there are writers out there who are trying to get these pictures made, and they do the things like that you've heard about. They get 20 credit cards, and they call up all the dentists and anesthesiologists and plumbers that they know who have a lot of money, and they try to get the picture made. And then that's only a third of the battle, because, you want to get it picked up, which means you want to get it seen. So, the script is really just the starting point. The difference I see, the relationship? The relationship is sort of, I think, deepened over the last 20 years because it's easier to get those pictures over here now. As you know, for a long time, we didn't get them here. So we wouldn't see a lot of stuff from Africa. But what helped with a lot of that is film festivals or places like this. We would fly these guys in, like bring in Kiarostami, who, because he got a lot of academic support, that's the way a lot of African film was seen, that has, as these movies have become just more available, as their visibility has increased, I think we sort of see a little bit of that, I think, in fact, in Daughters of the Dust and in East Bayou, the sense of a kind of organic community and the community being a character in the drama. I think that's unique to African culture. And it's something you don't sort of see in mainstream film or even in independent white film. They tend to be more sort of self-centered around a character rather than a circumstance in a community and how a group of people come to react to that. And that's where I see kind of a relationship and an influence too. I mean, I certainly talk to a lot of people now who say they've seen Fat Keen and think, well, this guy's amazing. I've got to see more of this stuff. And I think availability has made it that much easier. You know, just the world has gotten smaller in a good way. It's a pretty big fluke, isn't it? Wow, I mean that's interesting for her to think that, you know, because you know, Tom Hanks helped raise $5 million. I'm sorry, Hanks' wife helped raise $5 million for that. You know, and that was a successful show in Los Angeles for a long time, you know, so and it had a buzz in the film industry, so people were coming to it. There's a different circumstance for that same kind of show with an Asian American cast or an African American cast or a Latin American cast. It'll be treated as a kind of a specialty act. And people go see it and they'll say, I love it, but my boss won't let me make it. Or I love it, but we're the only ones that get it. Or I love it, but unless Tom Hanks' wife gets behind it, then it's not going to get made. So, I mean, that's a great story that she tells, but it's not like that she sort of came out of nowhere with this piece. And HBO was behind it, and there was always distribution for it. Lionsgate was going to pick it up, and they just lost confidence, and somebody else stepped in. But that kind of fluke is, I think, it relates to this. Because for a long time, the kind of African-American film that Oscar Micheaux did worked in the same way My Big Fat Greek Wedding is, in that he went from town to town with it, got the community interested, and got people to come out to see it. And that's what they did with My Big Fat Greek Wedding. If you notice, there weren't a whole lot of commercials for it. There still aren't a whole lot of commercials for it because word of mouth is still the most potent way to get an audience to come out to see a movie. There's a difference between the phenomenon, the hit that everybody goes to and nobody likes, and that would be like any of the Batman movies or the X-Men or any movie with man is the second part of it. Those are movies that everybody goes to and nobody likes because you feel like you just sort of have to go to it. But every year for the past few years, there's been a movie like My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Last year there was Memento, you know, and every year there's one that sort of proves that the studios really have eliminated from their thinking a part of the audience that doesn't get stimulated by movies. And the African-American audience goes to these movies. And you could do that same thing with African-American movies or movies with that kind of orientation. But the fact is, it's much easier to think, well, if we get so-and-so man and make a movie about that, we can sell it to everybody because it's a pre-sold product, and if it doesn't succeed, well, it wasn't our fault, so don't fire me. What the movie business is so much about nowadays, more than ever, is about taking pre-sold properties. It's making movies as commodities. It's taking what was essentially a gamble and trying to turn it into a science. And if that were the case, then My Big Fat Greek Wedding wouldn't be a hit. Wouldn't be a huge hit. You know, Tom Hanks' wife or not, you know, it wouldn't be a big deal. So that's a great word to use, that flukiness, taking a chance on that thing. And it was because it was a passion of Rita Wilson, who happens to be Greek, and saw a lot of herself in that movie. I've somehow managed to avoid that movie, but I'm going to be on a plane next week, so I know I'll be there. And I'll judge by the number of walkouts on the plane how good a picture it was. I don't know. You can never divorce what you are from what you do, and you shouldn't. I mean, I don't think that people, in fact, what I've heard more this week than any other time in my career, people coming to me going, I didn't know you were black. Oh, he's speaking this African-American thing. What does he know about African-Americans? Oh, he is an African-American. I've got that so many times this week. And I tend to get it a lot whenever people meet me, or I've been on NPR for a long time, and apparently I don't drop my G's at the end of my action words. And, you know, my grammar skills are okay, so I don't get identified in some stereotypical kind of way. But I can't separate the experience I've had from what I am. But on the other hand, I don't think anybody thinks I'm somebody who basically tries to say, you know, I will make a special case for something that isn't deserving of their time. That's the most important thing I can do. And I think it's dangerous to try to pretend that I'm something I'm not. I don't try to make a special case for asking for every movie with a black cast now, because I think they're too big a deal anymore. And also, that would get me eventually as a guy who only got the movies with all black casts. And I think it'd be bad for me too, because I see them all. I think they all connect. So I can't ignore that fact. But on the other hand, I think I'm probably cognizant of things that other critics are not because of my experience, in the same way that Tony Scott, A.O. Scott, has a different background from me, in the same way that Stephen Holden, who got started in the music business and writes cabaret reviews for the paper, has a different orientation than I do. I think that's what, hopefully, that distinctiveness makes me and them of a special value. Oh, she's got a pad. Oh, my God. Yes, Helen Thomas, UPI. What's your question?
I'm too old to remember now. I actually had a comment. First, I wanted to thank you for the comments on Pam Grier. When I was in high school, Foxy Brown Coffee and Sheba Brown were the movies. So
Sheba Baby, that's right.
So anyway, it was nice to hear someone say something nice about her. But I had a question which went back to something you said about Black Hawk Down, because you were talking about the image of the Africans in Black Hawk Down. And I was sitting here thinking, I don't know if I heard as much noise about the images in Black Hawk Down as I did about the comments in Barbershop, especially from the civil, well, some of the leadership that thought that those comments were so terrible. So I guess my question is, do you think there was a lot more discussion about the Barbershop issue than
Absolutely.
Black Hawk Down?
Absolutely.
And so what do you make of that?
You know what? Because it's easier to do that, because Barbershop is not a movie that everybody's embracing, you know. And Barbershop is a movie that feels like of no complications, an easy target. Barbershop is. And I think, incidentally, a lot of those comments are misdirected. The point of Barbershop is that Cedric the Entertainer is wrong, and that his best friend in the movie says, I can't go with you on that one. Everybody says he's wrong. And again, the point of the movie, at one point, his character, the only right thing he says is, this place is where we go to talk. I mean, that's supposed to be a place, traditionally, culturally, where black men go to say things they don't say in front of other people. And like I said the other day, Al Sharpton, who has a picture of himself with his hair being tamed into corn silk in the front page of the New York Post, of all people who should know that that is kind of, he's missing the point of Barbershop by attacking it, it's Al Sharpton. But I don't want to criticize him for not having been there on Black Hawk Down. I just know that I was surprised at the kind of approval, the kind of critical and cultural affirmation that movie got. It seemed absurd to me. And again, it's my job when I see a movie like that to read the book, to go over all the source material, and to see the book, which I was afraid would be racist, in fact is not, but it's certainly jingoistic, but it spells out all those sort of little insults, like I said, that accounted for the reaction to the American invading force. It seemed crazy to me. And on the other hand, a movie like Three Kings, from which a lot of Black Hawk Down stole, was called a mess. I think because the politics are a lot more complicated than Three Kings, but it's a better movie and a smarter movie than Black Hawk Down. Yes, it is my real hair. Really? You don't know a lot of people who did that? Because it's kind of amazing to me you don't. That's what I mean. Yeah, that's kind of amazing. Well, I don't know. It depends on your cultural concerns, I guess. I don't want to say it depends on your level of enlightenment because that's, well, maybe I do want to say that, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to say is this. It's about what you respond to. And you're right. I think there's more sophistication about what movies do technically than ever before. That we know what it's being done with edits because we've now been made a part of that conversation. MTV changed the way we dealt with all this stuff because they made the technology a part of the selling. That became a part of the commerce, the fact that we knew what they were doing, and they let us in on that joke, and that became a joke, in fact, that we were all inside. We all knew what they were telling us, and the joke was that it was all done with irony. But I think we can maybe understand the superficial things. I think content still gives a lot of people trouble. I still think when it comes to that sort of content, movies, people, audiences, critics, whatever you want to say, don't have the kind of sophistication because, and I think because of that superficiality being fostered now and fomented, we're used to making a certain kind of superficial judgment about the movies, and I think we do at our peril. I don't know why the people didn't respond to Black Hawk Down the way I did. It seems impossible not to see how irresponsible that movie was. And by doing that, that movie becomes essentially a recruiting poster and an ad for American intervention. You know, I mean, how big a jump is it from that to invading Iraq? I do it when I feel it's appropriate. And the great thing about the New York Times is I can literally say anything I want there. And they encourage a certain kind of conversation. I've worked in other places, and they will always say, well, and I actually did some work for CNN and want to do a piece on the, this is 5 years ago, the absence of dramas with African-American casts or African-American stars. And somebody went, well, what about Homicide? That's like one guy. And he's not the star of the show. Or what about NYPD Blue? He's not even the co-star of the show. What are you talking about? And they said, well, if the New York Times wrote about it, essentially, we deal with it. So I have to fight to get this on. And I'm in the position now, being the New York Times, where whatever else you say about it, people feel like it's the first place they go to get information, and especially information about the culture. So if I introduce something like this, it becomes a topic of conversation, so I don't have to do it on a continual basis. And in the case of something like Harry Potter, or, you know, I know all my nieces and nephews read it, And I just thought about them going to see it. And I, in fact, was in London the month before the movie came out and saw a bunch of these kids coming from an Indian restaurant running from a bookstore because they had passes to go see the movie like the second day, and they were thrilled about it. So if the movie's being sold to these kids, I think it's sort of wrong to pretend that the world is that wide. I mean, London is not like that anymore. Even the public schools, I mean, public/private schools aren't like that anymore. So I think it's ridiculous to sort of pretend like it is. Well, you just made the point that last part of the question. It is considered to be leisure. It's entertainment. It's not serious. And I think because it's thought of as being trivia, as being effluvia, essentially, that the enormous amount of weight. When you have a medium that changes the way people dream about themselves, and you can trace this back, there have been studies about, and then basically in the 40s and 50s, about the way kids dreamed in the early part of the century versus the way they dreamed once they started to go to the movies. Their dreams became movies. And so given the huge cultural and social and scientific kind of import of television, I think you're right. There should be something done about that. But how do you set that up? I'm from Detroit. There's literally barely money for an English department in many of the schools there. To say they have to address this, they would say they have other concerns. And it's kind of astonishing to me how many colleges don't really sort of deal with this. And I thought about Bruce's extremely intelligent comments before we got started. And to not sort of look at movies and television especially contextually, I think is just, it's misguided, and then it sort of diminishes the importance, and I think that's a great question, and you're absolutely right, there should be. I was trying to get him, sorry, because I think his arm's falling asleep. Yeah, I guess I was told by somebody here the other day that Slam played here for a week. And that's just sort of attendant on the way a studio sells a picture. They feel like it's, well, first of all, if a movie costs a lot of money, they will spend a lot of money to sell it. It's almost like they have to chase money to make money. If Triple X costs $100 million, they'll spend $100 million to sell it. If Slam costs $1 million to pick up, they'll spend $500,000 to sell it, unless it becomes a hit. And I think part of that, that question I sort of deal with a little bit here yesterday and today, is that sort of thing where actors who aren't actors get better treatment. You know, saying again here today, if you're an actor who's worked very hard at your craft, who takes it very seriously, and a pop star or comedian can get hired over you, and the next thing you know they're getting $20 million, then why would you keep at it? It's got to be hard-headedness. It's got to be stubbornness, determination. And what it will take to sort of get that kind of change that you're talking about is these movies actually making more of a commercial impact. There's only so much I can do. I wrote about Lumumba, and it basically barely got picked up. I saw it at the Cannes Film Festival. It was a great year at the Cannes Film Festival when I saw that. I saw Amores Perros, I saw Memento, I saw George Washington, and I saw Lumumba. And I thought, well, I'm at the New York Times. I'll write about these things, and they'll all get picked up, and they'll be huge money makers, and I'll have done my job, and I can take a presidential medal, and I can, you know, go write my novel and Endure the Gout in the south of France. I don't have gout, thank God, but these movies, for the most part, didn't get picked up, and it seemed, and every time I see people see them, everybody responds. Memento turned out to be a big hit. Amores Perros was nominated for the Academy Award. George Washington got seen a few places, was the kind of picture you're talking about, and it's a wonderful little movie that's great in that it's not about anything except people. And you know, these movies aren't hit, slam not hit. Basically, they'll say, well, nobody wants to see this stuff anymore. And the sad thing about it still is that it's considered to be axiomatic that a comedy with a black cast will make money because it'll cross over, but a drama will not. So that's just a truism. That's what the studios think. There is no scientific basis for it because, again, if there were, then they would have the facts to make movies that were hits all the time, and they don't. They just, it's an easy way to say no. Every time you say yes, you put your career at stake because that means a movie has a 90% chance of being a flop. Tom Cruise was hitting that last picture. I don't know why he wasn't hitting this one, you know. And so the only way to do that, to sort of deal with what you're talking about, is just to, you hear about a movie like this, you go to it, and you write a letter to the editor of the newspaper, and you find the email address of the filmmaker, you let them know what you think. Because the support that means the most is the gross. That's what means something to studios. That's what means something to people who pick these pictures up. There are more movies made in this country than ever before, because as I said on Wednesday, with the exception of me, and we have to change this, everybody has access to $1 million. Anybody can raise $1 million and get a picture shot. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how. Tell me how. I'll raise $1 million. But I meet so many people. Yeah, I raised $1 million. Could you come see my movie? Okay, if you raise $1 million, I'll come see your movie. And they do it. And these pictures don't get seen because there are too many of them. And if they're not right down the middle, and you have to remember that Pulp Fiction was turned down by every studio in Hollywood 3 times. Miramax basically is the carp of film studios. They're bottom feeders. Nobody wanted Pulp Fiction. Nobody wanted The Crying Game. Nobody wanted The English Patient. I know. It's amazing. But you can always find something interesting, maybe not always, but it's interesting in the stuff that doesn't get picked up. You go to festivals. Look for the little films, and I don't know, almost every town has a great video store that has stuff that nobody else has. And again, you know, Quentin Tarantino and his partner Roger Avery, they started work at video stores. And these guys are basically a real resource. You know, you go and say, what should I see? Every time I go to a new city, the first thing I do is I go to the great video store, the secondhand bookstore, and the music store, and ask what should I be listening to. It's the way to keep up, because there are always going to be people who are really fixated on this stuff, and it's the way to get information. And the great thing about things now is that information gets out faster than ever before, and it's what I was saying. That little movie with some great scene in it, it's going to have a scene stolen from it. And House Party has a scene stolen from an early Charles Burnett movie. It's an art movie. It's a black art movie, and the scene from it is in House Party. The scene where this kid's pouring like this, basically a block of sugar into a jar of Kool-Aid, and it's just a great scene, a throwaway scene from a killer sheep. So, again, these things all get stolen. Steven Soderbergh, before he starts work, every time he says to get his juices going, he watches a couple of Godard pictures. You look the way he cuts those movies. You look the way Out of Sight is cut. Basically, each fade is the end of a chapter. That's right, the Carabinier, Godard. You know, so it all ends up getting used. And was what I was saying yesterday. The unfortunate thing is that since a lot of these films that exist as history, a kind of history we don't want to remember, but about the way black people were regarded in the movies in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, that they aren't shown anymore is a real danger, because now we're missing a context, we're missing information. But again, I'm telling you, that cool video store, he's got a bunch of this cool stuff. Now, that guy's got that stuff that he videotaped in beta in 1979, and that's how you got to find it. This will be your question. Do you have a question? Okay. One more. Oh, and it's you. Go. They're not that down. What's amazing to me is I hadn't been to France for maybe about 6 or 7 years before I went to the Cannes Film Festival last year. You ever been to France? It is, without a doubt, worse than Italy, worse than Belgium, the worst pop in the Western world. It's amazing how bad it is. You see like cab drivers listening to the news in other languages because they won't listen to French pop. And the extent to which hip-hop has permeated France. I'm in the south of France. You're in Cannes. It's like farm country. It's like going to Boca Raton. And to hear hip-hop in Cannes, and to hear a 17-year-old white cab driver rapping along with a 6-year-old Biggie song, which he has no idea what's being said or how profane it is, that's playing on the radio, is amazing to me. And that's why I'm saying the revolution is going to come in a couple years when you can move that much faster. It basically, you think about this, a movie goes, it takes 1.5 years from first sitting down with the script to cutting to getting it out. That's how long it takes. You can go sit down in your house tonight, cut some hip-hop sides, get them on the internet tonight, and they can be around the world by midnight, our time. When the technology catches up with the means of production, that's when we'll see real change. That's when that speed, when that alacrity, when that velocity, the velocity of pop, which I love more than anything else, when that comes into the movies, then we'll get a chance to see that. Because you're right, it's crazy to me that, and Tupac wanted to be an actor. He basically trained as an actor. He and Jada Pinkett did scenes together in high school. So, I mean, he considered himself to be first and foremost an actor. So studios still don't get that. It's funny, the way I think that's really changing, if you watch Nickelodeon, hip-hop has suffused that. Kids grow up thinking that's the way they talk to each other. Even racists, even white supremacists now talk in hip-hop terms. It's amazing to me. And it would be the way that the world really changes in 5 or 6 years. You know, that's when that speed in getting a picture made, when studios are eliminated from the equation, when a lot of the walls break down, that's when things will be really great for colors of culture, including hip-hop.
And please join us upstairs. We have a reception up in the CERT Gallery. It's the ramp level, the 3rd floor, and it's a closing night reception for Elvis's lectures.